If you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. When the channel reaches 1,000 subscribers, I'll share a surprise story I've prepared especially for you. The desert was quiet except for the sound of a single horse's hooves on dry dirt. Dust rose behind the animal's legs and drifted across the flat land before dissolving into the evening air. The sun had nearly dropped behind the red mesas, leaving a thin line of gold light cutting across the horizon. Elias Rourke sat straight in the saddle, his jaw set, eyes half narrowed from the brightness. His coat was torn at the cuff, and his hat brim carried a dark sweat line from years of use. A long rifle was tied to the saddle, the metal dull from sand and wear. His right leg moved stiffly each time he shifted, a reminder of a bullet that never came out completely. He was 45, maybe a little older, though life out here didn't keep count. Elias had once been a scout for the cavalry. He quit after the raid at Sierra Cabra, a place where orders came down faster than judgment. It ended with bodies that shouldn't have been shot and a kind of silence he never escaped afterward. He left the army the next morning and rode until there was nowhere else to go. That was 10 years ago. Now he lived alone at the edge of Dry Valley, a patch of cracked earth and stubborn brush, miles from the nearest town. His ranch was barely standing. A small cabin, a half-roofed barn, a corral with one tired horse and a few goats. It wasn't much, but it was his way of keeping distance between himself and the world he failed to live in. As he reached the gate, the horse snorted. Elias climbed down, every movement deliberate. The limp in his leg had worsened over the years, especially in cold weather, and the ache never really stopped. He untied the rifle, rested it against the fence, and began checking the trough. The water had dropped to a shallow puddle. He knelt, rubbed the horse's neck, and whispered, "We'll fill it tomorrow." His voice was low, rough from days without speaking. Inside the cabin, the air smelled of smoke and coffee grounds. He lit the oil lamp on the table and set his hat aside. The place was small: one bed, a table, a stove, a chair, and a shelf with 3 books he'd read too many times. The floor creaked when he moved. He poured himself coffee from a blackened pot, drank it slowly, and stared at the wall. It was how most nights went: silence, the ticking of the clock, and the sound of wind outside. He had no family, no friends nearby. He kept himself alive with routine. Mend a fence, feed the animals, ride out to check the land, return before dark. He didn't think much about tomorrow, because every day was meant to look the same. That sameness was the only kind of peace he trusted. Just before midnight, the dog started barking. At first, he thought it was coyotes, but the sound was different, shorter, sharper, closer. He reached for the rifle and stepped outside, boots crunching on hard dirt. The air was cold and dry. His lantern's light cut through the dark far enough to show 3 shapes beyond the fence line. "Who's there?" he called out. His voice carried across the yard, calm but ready. The figures stopped. One of them, a woman, stepped forward, hands raised. "We need food," she said. Her accent was Mexican, her voice hoarse from travel. Behind her stood 2 others, one wearing a torn shawl, the other wrapped in a blanket, both thin and unsteady. Elias kept the rifle pointed down, but didn't lower it completely. He scanned their faces. They looked worn out, frightened, and hungry, not the kind of people who came to steal. Still, habit made him cautious. Out here, pity could get a man killed. "How far have you come?" he asked. 3 days, the first woman said. "From the south." He could see their hands shaking in the lantern light. He noticed one was barefoot, another carrying a small bundle that might have been a child's blanket. There was no child. He stood there a moment longer, thinking. He didn't owe them anything, and they didn't owe him mercy if he was wrong about them. But leaving them outside would mean death by morning. He felt the old ache in his chest, the one that came from memory, not the wound in his leg. He lowered the rifle. "There's stew inside. You can eat, then rest. Tomorrow you move on." The women hesitated. The one in front nodded first. "Thank you." Inside, they sat by the fire. The cabin filled with quiet sounds, spoons against tin bowls, the pop of the logs. Elias kept his distance, leaning against the doorframe, rifle still nearby. He watched them eat with small, cautious bites, eyes darting to him between each mouthful. The woman who had spoken first looked up finally. "My name's Marisol," she said. "That's Taya, and the young one's Leah." He nodded once. "Elias." No one spoke again after that. When the food was gone, the youngest, Leah, fell asleep near the fire. Taya sat upright, hands around her knees, staring at the flames without blinking. Marisol looked at Elias for a long moment, studying him the way people do when they think they've seen a ghost before. "You live here alone?" she asked. "Always." She nodded slowly. "Figures." He didn't ask what she meant. He didn't ask where they came from or who they'd lost. He already knew what kind of eyes grief gave people, and all three of them had that look. Elias sat back in the chair, rifle across his knees, keeping watch until the fire burned low. He told himself it was only for one night. He didn't believe it. Outside, the wind moved across the valley, and the sound of the dogs faded into the distance. Inside, for strangers shared a single silence that none of them understood yet, the kind that comes before everything changes. Morning came with the sound of wind slipping through the cracks in the cabin walls. The fire had burned down to faint embers, and the room carried the cold of a desert dawn. Elias woke first. He sat up slowly, his legs stiff, the pain dull but constant. He looked toward the hearth. The three women were still there, wrapped in blankets he had given them. For a moment, he considered waking them and sending them off before the sun climbed too high. That had been his plan. But when he saw the youngest, Leah, curled up near the fire, her face pale and tired, he knew they wouldn't make it far without rest or food. He put on coffee, the smell filling the room. The sound of the pot drew Marisol's attention. She sat up, combed her dark hair back with her fingers, and said quietly, "We'll be gone by noon." Her tone was defensive, as if she expected him to challenge it. Elias poured coffee into 2 tin cups and set one near her. "You can stay till the wind settles. It's rough out there today." She looked at him, suspicious but tired enough to accept. "We'll work for the food," she said. He didn't answer, but the small nod he gave was enough. By the time the sun rose, the sky had turned pale orange. Outside, Taya stood by the corral, watching the horizon. Her black hair was tied back, her arms folded tight against the cold. Elias joined her after checking the water troughs. He didn't say anything. She didn't either. After a few minutes, she finally asked, "Why are you here alone?" He took a moment before answering. Didn't find anywhere else that fit. She turned her head, studying him. "Or maybe nowhere else would have you." He met her eyes, calm, unshaken. "Could be both." Taya looked away again, her expression unreadable. The silence between them wasn't hostile, just the kind that came from two people who had already run out of things worth explaining. Back inside, Leah helped Marisol clean up the dishes. Her movements were uncertain, careful. She couldn't have been more than 20. When she looked up and met Elias's gaze, she smiled politely, the kind of smile people give when they're still measuring the distance between fear and trust. "You're the first man who hasn't chased us off," she said. Her voice was soft, barely above a whisper. Elias took a seat by the table, hands around his coffee cup. "Not many people left out here to do the chasing," he said. Leah hesitated, then added, "We came from the border towns. There was sickness, and men who wanted what wasn't theirs." He nodded. He'd seen that kind of ruin before. Towns breaking apart from hunger and fear, people doing whatever they had to. He didn't ask what happened to their families. The answer sat plainly in their faces. By noon, Marisol approached him again. "We should go," she said. "You've done enough." Elias looked toward the horizon, where the wind carried dust like smoke. "Storm's not done," he said. "Wait till evening. No good walking through it." She frowned, half convinced, half annoyed. "You always decide for others?" "No," he said quietly. "Just trying to keep you alive." The line landed heavier than he intended. Marisol blinked, not expecting that kind of honesty. She didn't reply. She went back inside, her movements slower now, her pride softening into fatigue. By evening, the wind had dropped and the land was calm again. Elias sat outside, sharpening his knife against a flat stone. He heard footsteps and saw Marisol approach. She crossed her arms and watched him for a moment before speaking. "I've been trying to place your face," she said. Back when my husband and I lived near Sierra Cabra, there was a man, one of the scouts. He had your eyes. Elias's hands stopped moving. He didn't look up. That was a long time ago. So, if it's true, she said quietly. You were there. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. The silence confirmed it. Marisol stepped back, her eyes hard. You killed him. He met her gaze now, steady and cold. I killed a lot of men. Orders don't leave room for questions. Taya, standing by the corral, had turned her head toward them, listening without showing it. Leah stood frozen in the doorway, holding a folded blanket. Marisol's voice shook, not from fear but from the weight of words she'd waited years to say. He was no raider. He was fixing a roof when they came. Elias said nothing. He couldn't defend it, and he wouldn't lie. He set down the knife, stood slowly, and looked at her with a kind of calm that wasn't peace, just the quiet that comes when a man stops pretending he deserves forgiveness. You can take the horse, he said. There's food enough for 2 days. Go wherever you need to. Marisol stared at him for a long time. And if we stay? He hesitated. Then you stay. No conditions, no excuses. Just that. That night, the cabin felt smaller, the air thick with something none of them could name. Elias sat by the fire, thinking about the sound of rifles, about faces he remembered in flashes. Men shouting, smoke rising, the weight of what followed. He didn't expect them to forgive him, and he didn't want them to. He just wanted the chance to do something right before the years ran out. Leah sat by the table, sewing a torn sleeve. Taya moved quietly behind her, refilling the pot. Marisol sat near the fire, her eyes never leaving him. The room held 4 people, but no one spoke. Only the slow rhythm of small actions filled the silence, the kind of silence that wasn't empty, but waiting for something to take shape. Outside, the wind had gone still. Inside, Elias knew they wouldn't be leaving in the morning. He didn't know why yet. Maybe because survival had tied them together. Maybe because guilt and grief sometimes spoke the same language. Whatever it was, the cabin no longer felt like one man's exile. It felt like the beginning of something neither of them had planned. And for the first time in years, Elias didn't mind that the night would be long. The next morning arrived gray and cold. A layer of mist hung low over the dry ground, turning the valley into a quiet blur. The fire in the cabin had burned down again, and the smell of smoke and damp would fill the air. Elias opened the door, stepped outside, and felt the stiffness in his leg pull like wire. He ignored it, as he always did, and went to feed the horse. Behind him, the door creaked, and he heard movement inside, soft, uncertain, but alive. The women were still there. He had half expected to wake and find them gone, the blankets folded neatly, the fire dead cold. But they hadn't left. That realization carried both relief and unease. When he returned inside, Leah was already setting up a small pot on the stove. Her hair was tied back roughly, her hands red from washing in cold water. She looked up with a quick, shy glance. You got flour and beans, she said. We can make something. Elias nodded, sitting by the table. Do what you need. His tone was quiet, not distant, a man used to others moving around his space. Marisol came in next, carrying a bucket of water from the well. She moved with a kind of steady purpose, as if work itself was the only way she could stand to be here. When she caught Elias watching her, she paused. We'll pull our weight, she said firmly. No one's taking charity. He nodded again. Never said you were. Taya entered last, silent as always. She set down a bundle of dry sticks and added them to the fire. Her eyes brushed against his for a second before she turned away. That single look carried more meaning than words would have, a mixture of guarded respect and unresolved anger. By mid-morning, they ate in silence. The food was simple: beans, dry bread, a bit of coffee. Leah hummed softly while cleaning dishes, the same tune as before. Elias recognized it now. It was an old frontier lullaby, something mothers used to sing to children to drown out the sound of wind outside thin walls. He hadn't heard it in years. After breakfast, they divided the day's work without discussion. Elias repaired the corral fence, Marisol cleaned the cabin, Leah washed clothes by the creek, and Taya followed him outside to help move lumber. For the first time since they'd arrived, the place felt almost like a home, or at least like a group of people trying to survive together instead of waiting for something to end. Taya worked quietly, her movements efficient and strong. Elias noticed the way she avoided looking at him directly, as though too much eye contact might pull old memories back to life. After an hour of silence, she finally spoke. "You fought for them?" she asked without turning. "Who?" "The soldiers. The ones who burned our camp." He paused, leaning against a post. "I fought for whoever gave the orders. That's what men did when they didn't have land or family. You could have walked away." "I did," he said. "Just too late." Taya didn't reply. She lifted the next beam and fitted it into place. Her face was calm, but he could see the tightness in her jaw, the effort it took to keep anger from spilling out. Inside the cabin, Marisol found Elias's rifle propped against the wall. She studied it, the barrel clean, the stock worn from years of use. She ran her fingers along the notches carved near the trigger guard. "How many?" she asked when Elias came in later. He stopped in the doorway. "Enough." She set the rifle down. "You still keep it close." "Habit," he said. "No," she answered, shaking her head. "You keep it because you think you'll need it again. Men like you always do." Elias didn't argue. She wasn't wrong. There was a part of him that still expected violence, a part that didn't know how to exist without it. Leah broke the tension by setting a cup of water in front of him. "It's getting warmer out," she said gently. "Maybe the soil will take seeds soon." He looked at her. "Nothing grows here easy." "Maybe not," she replied, smiling faintly. "But maybe we can make a try." That night, after the chores were done, Elias sat outside with his coat pulled tight against the cold. The land stretched wide and empty before him, the horizon fading into darkness. Behind him, he could hear laughter, quiet, uncertain but real. Leah had said something that made Marisol smile. Even Taya's low voice joined in once, brief but noticeable. It was the first sound of life this place had heard in years. Elias felt something unfamiliar stir in him. Not peace exactly, but the small beginning of it. He realized how long it had been since anyone had shared this space with him, how much he had built his silence into a wall that no one could climb. These women hadn't come here to forgive him. They'd come because they had nowhere left to go. Yet somehow, by staying, they were turning his exile into something less hollow. Later, when the others had gone to sleep, Elias stayed awake by the dying fire. His mind wandered to questions he hadn't asked. Who they'd lost, how they had survived the journey here, why they hadn't left after learning what he'd done. He understood that some answers didn't need words. Maybe they were here for the same reason he was, to keep breathing when the world had stopped offering reasons to. He poured another cup of coffee and stared into the flames until they sank into embers. Outside, coyotes howled in the distance. The wind moved across the plains, carrying the smell of rain. He didn't know what the next day would bring, but for the first time in years, he didn't dread it. In the faint orange light of the fire, the cabin behind him looked different, not like a man's hiding place, but like something being rebuilt from ruin. And as the night deepened, Elias realized that maybe survival wasn't just about staying alive anymore. Maybe it was about learning how to stay with others, even when everything in the past told him to live alone. The days after the rain smelled cleaner. The air held a faint coolness, the kind that softened the edges of the heat that had lingered all summer. The women stayed, though no one said it outright. Their things remained in corners of the cabin, a shawl over a chair, a comb on the windowsill, a small beaded pouch beside the bed. Elias didn't ask when they planned to leave. He told himself it didn't matter. But each morning when he woke and heard movement inside, the scrape of a pan, a quiet hum, the sound of someone stepping outside for water, he felt a kind of steadiness that he hadn't felt in years. He worked longer hours than usual, fixing fences, mending the roof, digging new channels for the runoff before the next storm season. The women helped without being told. Leah carried water from the creek. Marisol patched clothes and repaired the garden fence, and Taya handled the animals with an ease that made Elias watch her in silence. He realized then how little he understood about people like her, how his years of soldiering had stripped him of the ability to see beyond the uniforms, the language, and the orders. Now he watched her move quietly through the corral, brushing the horse's neck with calm precision, and he felt both guilt and a strange, quiet admiration. At night, when they gathered for dinner, small conversations began to fill the room. Marisol would tell stories about the ranch she'd grown up on before the war. Leah would listen closely, sometimes asking questions that made the older woman smile for the first time in weeks. Taya rarely spoke, but when she did, everyone listened. Her voice carried a kind of calm that didn't need volume. One evening, as the sky turned a bruised shade of blue and the air grew heavy, Elias noticed the wind shifting direction. He stepped out onto the porch, scanning the horizon. The smell of dust hit first, sharp, dry, electric. A storm was coming fast from the west. He called out to Marisol to bring in the tools and told Leah to latch the shutters. The quiet peace that had filled the ranch turned tense in seconds. The first gust hit with a howl. Sand and grit swirled around the cabin, scraping against the walls. Elias tried to secure the door, but the wind pressed hard against it, forcing it open again. Taya ran to help him, pushing with both hands until it shut tight. Outside, the sky went black. Lightning flashed in the distance, followed by the dull, rolling growl of thunder. The roof creaked. Elias grabbed a lantern and limped toward the barn. "The animals," he said, and before anyone could argue, he was already outside. The rain came hard, sudden and violent. Each drop stung against his face. The ground turned slick under his boots, but he pushed forward, using the light from the lantern to find his way. Inside the barn, the horses were panicked, kicking against the stalls. He moved carefully, speaking low to calm them. His voice was steady, but his breath came fast. He wasn't a young man anymore. Every movement reminded him of it. Behind him, the door slammed open again. Taya stepped inside, soaked, her hair plastered against her face. She grabbed a rope and started tying down the gate without a word. Elias wanted to tell her to go back, but she didn't look like someone who took orders anymore. When he met her eyes, he saw no anger there, only focus and strength. The roof began to leak. Water dripped down the walls, soaking the hay. "We can't save it all," Elias said, breath rough. Taya nodded. "Then save what we can." They worked through the worst of it. By the time they returned to the cabin, both were drenched and shivering. Marisol and Leah had managed to keep the fire alive. The room was dim, the air thick with the smell of wet wood and smoke. Elias hung his coat by the hearth and sat heavily on the chair, his leg throbbing. Leah handed him a dry blanket. "You're bleeding," she said quietly. He looked down and saw the tear in his trousers, a small cut just above the knee, reopened from the strain. "It's nothing," he said, but it wasn't nothing. The pain crawled up his thigh, deep and old, like the memory of every bad winter he'd worked through. He tried to hide it, but Marisol saw the tremor in his hand as he reached for his coffee. "You shouldn't have gone out there alone," she said. Her voice wasn't harsh, just steady. "Wouldn't have made a difference," Elias replied. Marisol stared at him for a moment before replying softly. "That's what men like you always say. Until it kills them." Leah looked between them, uneasy, while Taya sat quietly near the fire, wringing out her braid. The storm howled outside, pressing against the walls, but inside, a different tension had settled, something fragile, human, and close. After a long silence, Taya spoke. "You could have left us that first night," she said, her voice low. "You didn't. You could have sent us away this morning. You didn't." "Why?" Elias met her eyes. "Didn't seem right." "Right," Taya repeated. "Or did you need someone to forgive you?" The words hit hard, but he didn't flinch. "Maybe both," he said. Taya held his gaze, searching for something: anger, weakness, guilt. Whatever she found, it quieted her. She looked back at the fire. "Forgiveness isn't something you ask for," she said softly. "It's something you keep working toward." The storm lasted through the night. They slept in turns, the cabin shaking from the wind. Elias sat by the door, keeping watch even when he could barely keep his eyes open. Every few minutes, lightning flashed through the window, illuminating the room. 3 women resting close to the fire, faces peaceful for once. He realized how strange it felt to be trusted enough to protect someone again. By dawn, the storm had passed. The land outside was soaked and quiet. The air smelled of wet soil and smoke. When Elias stepped outside, the horizon looked clearer than it had in months. The damage was bad, but fixable. The barn roof would need patching. Some tools were gone, but they'd survived it. Marisol came out after him, wrapping her shawl tighter. "You're limping worse," she said. "I'll manage." "You always say that." He gave a faint smile. "Because it's true." She didn't return the smile, but her voice softened. "You've got help now. You should start using it." For once, he didn't argue. As the sun rose over the valley, they stood together in the wet grass, watching the steam lift from the earth. The storm had left its mark on the land and on them. It didn't wash away the past, but it made something new grow in its place, a fragile sense that maybe they could build a life here, not out of forgiveness, but out of the simple act of surviving together. Inside the cabin, Leah was already humming again, and Taya was starting a fire for breakfast. The smoke rose straight into the pale morning sky. Elias watched it drift upward, steady and unbroken, and felt for the first time in years that staying might be worth it. The night came cold and clear. The storm washed away, but not forgotten. The ground outside was slick, reflecting the orange light spilling from the cabin windows. Inside, the smell of smoke and damp would still lingered. Elias sat near the fire, his bad legs stretched out, wrapped in a torn strip of cloth. Marisol and Taya moved quietly, one cleaning the table, the other mending the broken latch on the door. Leah stirred stew in a pot, humming under her breath. The ranch had survived, but so had everything buried inside them. The unspoken questions that had started to build since the night they arrived. Marisol's stare had grown heavier each day. Taya's silence had turned watchful instead of cautious. And Leah, though gentle and kind, had begun to see things she didn't understand. The glances, the tension, the way Elias avoided looking any of them in the eye for too long. When the food was ready, they gathered at the table. No one spoke much. The storm had left everyone tired. But after they ate, Marisol didn't rise. She stayed seated, eyes fixed on Elias. "We should talk," she said, voice steady but low. He looked at her, already knowing what she meant. "All right." Taya stopped her work and leaned against the wall, arms crossed. Leah sat quietly, unsure if she should stay. Marisol's hands were clasped tightly on the table. "Back then, at Sierra Cabra, there was a raid. They said soldiers came at dawn. Men died, families scattered. You were there, weren't you?" Elias didn't move for a moment. Then he nodded once. "Yes." "What were you doing there?" "Following orders," he said flatly. "They told us it was a raider camp. We were sent to clear it." Marisol's voice trembled but didn't rise. There were no raiders. It was a settlement. Farmers. Families. He looked down at his hands. "I know that now." The room went still. Leah's eyes widened. She hadn't known. She turned toward him, face pale in the firelight. "You killed them?" she whispered. Elias's voice cracked slightly when he answered. "Not all of them, but I was part of it." The fire popped, filling the silence. Outside, the wind was calm, as if the land itself were listening. Marisol's jaw tightened. "You killed my husband," she said. "He wasn't a soldier. He was trying to take our children away before the shooting started. He didn't even have a gun." Elias's shoulders stiffened. He looked up, meeting her eyes for the first time. "I remember him. He was the one who ran toward the well." Her hand trembled. "You remember that?" "I do," he said, voice low. "I see it every time I close my eyes." Taya moved closer, her voice calm but sharp. "And you just kept living? Built yourself a home and pretended it didn't happen?" Elias took a long breath. "No, I came here to remember it, to live with it. I figured if I stayed out here long enough, the land might take me too. But it didn't. Not yet." No one spoke for a long time. The only sound was the faint crackle of the fire. Leah's eyes glistened. She didn't know what to feel. She wanted to hate him, but the man sitting in front of her looked broken in a way that hate couldn't fix. Marisol stood. "Then why us? Why let us stay here?" He hesitated before answering. "Because maybe I owe you something I can't ever pay. Food, shelter, a place to rest. It's not enough, but it's all I've got." Marisol stared at him for a long time, searching for something, truth, regret, or maybe a reason to leave. But what she saw instead was a man who carried the same emptiness they did. "You think pity will make this right?" she said. "No," he said, "but leaving you outside that night would have made it worse." Taya watched him closely, then asked the question that none of them had dared before. "Do you regret it?" Elias's eyes softened, and for a moment, he looked older than he was. "Every morning," he said quietly, "and every night." Something shifted in the room then. The air didn't ease, but it changed, the way tension sometimes breaks without vanishing. Marisol lowered her gaze. Leah looked down at her hands, and Taya, though she said nothing, finally sat near the fire instead of standing apart. Leah was the first to move. She poured coffee and handed it to Elias. "You can't undo it," she said softly, "but maybe you can stop trying to die for it." He met her eyes, unsure how to respond. There was no forgiveness there, but there was humanity, the kind he hadn't expected to see again. Marisol broke the silence next. "We're not leaving," she said. "Not yet. We'll work here, same as before. But don't mistake that for forgiveness." "I won't," he said. Taya added, "We don't forgive. We live. That's all." Elias nodded slowly. "Then we'll live." The fire burned lower, throwing long shadows on the walls. The tension hadn't vanished, but something new had taken its place, a fragile understanding that none of them could name. Later, when everyone had gone to sleep, Elias sat alone by the dying fire. The confession had drained him, but in its place came a strange calm. The truth was out now. The ghosts had names again. He couldn't make peace with the past, but maybe he could build something that would last beyond it. He glanced toward the corner where the women slept. For the first time, he saw not the faces of people he owed, but the faces of people who had chosen, despite everything, to stay. Outside, the night was quiet. The rain had washed the valley clean. The land still carried scars, just like they did, but it was alive again. And somewhere deep down, Elias felt a small, unfamiliar thought take root, that maybe the rest of his life didn't have to be about running from what he'd done. Maybe it could be about helping others survive it. He reached for his coat, fed the fire one last log, and let the light steady the room. For the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. And though none of them would say it aloud, the hardest part, the truth itself, had already been faced. What came next would be different. Hard, maybe, but there's to decide. The first frost came early. By late October, the mornings had turned sharp, the kind of cold that bit through clothes before the sun rose high enough to soften it. The land outside the cabin looked drained of color, the brush gone gray, the creek edges hardening with ice. Elias knew what was coming. Winter in the valley didn't forgive carelessness. It forced people to plan, to work to stay close. For the first time in years, he wasn't alone for it. They had survived the storm, the truth, and the silence that came after. What remained was something steadier, not peace, not comfort, but a rhythm that made sense. Each day started before dawn. Marisol managed the food, careful with every handful of flour. Taya chopped wood and watched the livestock. Leah mended clothes, cooked, and sang quietly while she worked. Elias moved through his chores with a limp that worsened in the cold, but he never slowed more than he had to. The ranch felt alive again. It wasn't happiness that filled it, more like endurance wrapped in calm. No one talked about forgiveness anymore. It wasn't needed. They had learned to move forward without erasing what had come before. Still, small things began to change. Marisol spoke to Elias without the bitterness in her voice. She still kept distance, but when she saw him straining to lift a barrel or fix a post, she no longer turned away. She handed him tools, offered short, practical advice, and when he thanked her, she nodded once without looking up. Taya remained watchful, but less guarded. She began teaching Elias how to tie certain leather bindings she used for the horses, stronger, she said, than the ones he made. Sometimes they worked side by side in silence for hours. One afternoon, while repairing a saddle, Elias asked, "You ever think of leaving?" She tightened the strap and said, "Where would I go? The land out there remembers the same things I do. Might as well stay where it's quiet." Leah was the one who changed the most. She had been timid when she arrived, but now she moved through the cabin with confidence. She'd started reading from Elias's old Bible at night, not preaching, just reading. The words gave structure to the silence. Elias never joined in, but he listened from his chair by the fire, the sound of her voice carrying through the small room like something steady to hold on to. As the cold deepened, so did the routine. They stacked wood until their hands blistered, salted meat, and patched the roof again. At night, they sat around the fire, the air filled with the smell of stew, smoke, and damp wool. Sometimes they talked small stories about the places they came from, about food they missed, about the noise of towns they'd once called home. The conversations didn't last long, but they were enough to make the nights shorter. One evening, when the snow began to fall outside, Elias found Leah sitting on the porch, watching it. Her hair caught the light from the doorway. She looked peaceful, but her expression carried the kind of thought that didn't belong to youth. "You shouldn't be out here," he said. She smiled faintly. "It's quiet. I like it." Elias leaned against the post beside her, looking out over the dark valley. "It's going to be a long winter." "I know," she said, "but we're not alone this time." He glanced at her, caught off guard by how simply she said it. No hesitation, no weight, just truth. He nodded. "No, we're not." Inside, Taya and Marisol were arguing softly about how much wood to save. The sound was ordinary, domestic, and strangely comforting. Elias realized he hadn't heard that kind of noise, the sound of people who trusted the space they lived in, since before Sierra Cabra. Later that week, a blizzard hit. The snow came hard, piling against the door, muting the outside world. The wind howled for 2 days straight. They took turns, keeping the fire alive. The cabin grew smaller, warmer, almost like it was breathing with them. At night, they shared stories not about loss, but about the small things they remembered. A horse that used to wander off, a meal shared with family, a summer that never seemed to end. On the third night, while the storm still battered the walls, Elias woke to find Taya sitting near the window, sharpening her knife by candlelight. He sat up, pulling his coat closer. "Can't sleep?" She shook her head. "Storm sounds too much like something else." He knew what she meant. "Gunfire," he said quietly. She didn't look at him, but nodded. "It's strange how it stays in your ears." He wanted to say something that would help, but words didn't come easy. Instead, he reached for the pot and poured her a cup of coffee. She accepted it, and for a moment, their eyes met. It wasn't forgiveness. It was understanding, the kind that didn't need to be spoken. By morning, the storm had passed. The world outside was white and silent. The sun broke through the clouds, hitting the snow in flashes of silver light. Elias stepped out with his coat tight around him, breath turning to mist. He looked over the valley, fences buried, fields gone still. And yet, for the first time, it didn't feel empty. Behind him, Leah laughed as she stepped into the snow barefoot, just for a second before Marisol shouted at her to come back inside. The sound of it, sharp, bright, full of life, echoed off the hills. Elias turned toward it and felt something warm cut through the cold. Inside, he helped Taya and Marisol clear the hearth, fix the broken hinge, and start breakfast. It wasn't about duty anymore. It was something closer to belonging. They worked in silence, but it was a silence filled with purpose. That night, when the fire burned low, Elias spoke for the first time about what he wanted next. "When spring comes," he said, "I'll build another barn. We can grow more, keep more stock." Marisol raised an eyebrow. "We?" He looked around at them, at the three faces that had somehow become his reason for staying. "If you're still here," he said. Taya didn't answer. Marisol didn't either. But Leah smiled and said, "We'll see." Outside, the snow fell again, soft and slow, covering the valley in white. Inside, the firelight moved across their faces, steady and calm. The war, the guilt, the fear, all of it had settled into something else now. Not peace, not redemption, but the quiet act of living, together, in the only way they knew how. And though none of them said it aloud, each of them knew that when spring came, they wouldn't be leaving. Would you like me to continue seamlessly with Chapter 7, written in the same cinematic, emotionally grounded tone, showing the arrival of spring, the sense of renewal, and a final, complete resolution with a hopeful ending? When the snow finally began to melt, the land released a sound Elias had almost forgotten: water moving. It trickled down from the hills, ran through the cracks of frozen soil, and gathered in the dry creek until the stream found its voice again. The first green blades pushed through the mud by late March. It was the kind of change that came slow but steady, the kind you only noticed because of how quiet it had been before. Inside the cabin, life followed its new rhythm. Leah swept the floors with the windows open, letting the cold air clear out the smell of wood smoke. Marisol kneaded dough at the table, humming an old Spanish tune she hadn't sung in years. Taya fed the horses, her braid loose for once, a streak of sunlight cutting across her face. Elias worked outside, repairing what winter had broken, fences, troughs, and the roof of the chicken coop that had half collapsed under the snow. He moved slower now, not from pain, but from caution. His legs still ached, but not enough to stop him. The ache had become part of the day, something he worked through like any other chore. He noticed that his steps didn't echo anymore when he walked into the house. The sound of others moving, talking, or just being there filled the space. The emptiness that had lived with him for years had been pushed out by life. One afternoon, while fixing the corral gate, Leah came out carrying a pot of coffee. She set it down beside him, her face flushed from the sun. "Marisol says you're working too much again," she said. He smiled slightly. "Marisol says that every day." "She's right," Leah said, sitting on the fence rail. "You don't have to fix everything by yourself." Elias leaned on the post, looking at her. "Old habits," he said. She nodded. "Maybe it's time for new ones." It wasn't the kind of conversation he was used to, but the way she said it, calm, almost teasing, made him realize how far they had all come. None of them were running anymore. They were rebuilding. That evening, Marisol gathered everyone around the table. There was stew, bread, and for the first time, a bottle of wine she had kept hidden in her bundle since before they arrived. "For making it through the winter," she said, filling 4 cups. Elias hesitated, then raised his. "To the work that's left," he said. Taya gave a faint smile. "There's always more work." Marisol smirked. "Then we'll have to keep staying." They laughed, a real sound this time, rough, unpolished, but honest. It carried through the cabin and out into the open night. As days passed, the land began to change with them. Wildflowers grew along the fence line. The creek filled again. The barn roof was fixed, the garden fenced, and the chickens had started laying. Elias built a second trough, and Taya helped him shape it from rough-cut wood. They didn't talk much, but their silence had turned easy, familiar. When their hands brushed over the tools, neither pulled away. Leah painted the window frames blue using leftover dye from old cloth. Marisol laughed when she saw it. "Too bright," she said, but she didn't ask her to change it. The cabin, once gray and forgotten, began to look like a place that belonged to someone again. One afternoon, as the sun dropped behind the ridge, Elias stood by the corral watching the horses. He heard the door open behind him and turned to see Taya step out. She walked over, her steps quiet in the grass. "You've built yourself a new life," she said. He shook his head. "We built it." Taya looked at him for a moment, then nodded. "So what happens now?" "Now," Elias said, "we stay alive. We work. Maybe that's enough." "It is," she said softly. Leah joined them a few minutes later, carrying a small basket of eggs. Marisol followed, wiping her hands on her apron. They stood together for a while, watching the sun sink into the valley. The light turned everything gold. For the first time in years, Elias didn't think about the past. He didn't think about the men he'd killed or the orders he'd followed. He thought about the sound of laughter inside the cabin, about the smell of food cooking, about the 3 women who had turned his punishment into a kind of home. Marisol broke the silence. "We could leave now if we wanted," she said. Elias looked at her. "You could." She tilted her head slightly. "But we won't." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. They all understood. That night, the 4 of them ate on the porch. The sky was clear, stars spread wide and sharp. The wind carried the scent of wet soil and pine. The valley stretched out before them, no longer empty, no longer a place of ghosts. Leah leaned her head against the post, eyes half closed, and whispered, "It's good here." Elias looked out over the land, his hands resting still for once. "It's home," he said quietly. Marisol smiled. Finally, Taya reached over, and placed a hand on the table near his. Not touching, just close enough to be felt. "You've made peace with it?" she asked. Elias thought for a long moment. "No," he said, "but I've made peace with staying." The fire crackled softly. The horses shifted in the distance. The air carried no tension now, only the calm that comes when everything broken has been lived through, not fixed, just endured. As the night deepened, Elias leaned back in his chair, the weight in his chest lighter than it had been in years. The world had changed quietly around him, piece by piece, until one morning he looked up and realized he wasn't alone anymore. He had killed their husbands once, and somehow, through years of silence, storms, and the stubborn act of staying, they had built something out of what was left. When the lamp burned low, Marisol gathered the dishes, Leah closed the door, and Taya added one last log to the fire. Elias stayed outside a little longer, watching the last light fade from the sky. The land was still alive again. He breathed in the cold air and let it fill him. For the first time in a long life, he wasn't running, fighting, or regretting. He was simply living, and that, he decided, was enough. The end.